sun had set hours ago, leaving the city blanketed in a warm summer darkness as Jonathan Blake made his way through the community center's narrow hallway. He paused, feeling the weight of the day press heavily on his shoulders. At 52, Jonathan had spent more years than he could count fighting the same battles, advocating for a community he loved and defending the rights of people who had come to him when no one else would listen. For him, this wasn't just a job, it was his life's purpose, and tonight was a culmination of it all. His footsteps echoed in the nearly empty building as he glanced down at the briefcase in his hand. Felt heavy, not just with the documents inside, but with the gravity of what those documents meant. Hours of testimony, leaked files, video footage, and statements from a brave young whistleblower inside the police department had turned his case from a spark to an undeniable fire. He had finally gathered what he needed. The undeniable proof that could expose the depth of corruption woven into the city's police force. With this evidence, lives could be saved, lives ruined, and those who had abused their power for years could finally be held accountable. As he reached the exit, he stopped for a moment, letting his eyes wander through the familiar halls. Every corner of this place was filled with memories, late nights organizing community meetings, weekends spent listening to families share their grief, and countless calls from mothers, fathers, and neighbors who had experienced the worst of a system meant to protect them. Jonathan had given everything to these people, and in return, they had given him a reason to keep going. But tonight was different. He could feel it in the air, thick with the humidity of a summer night and a tension he couldn't quite shake. Pushing open the door, he stepped into the night, feeling the humidity wrap around him. The community center parking lot was empty, save for a few scattered streetlights casting faint pools of yellow across the cracked pavement. He took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of warm asphalt and the faint odor of gasoline from a nearby gas station. In moments like these, he often found himself grateful for small details like these, a reminder of his roots in this city and the countless days and nights he'd spent fighting for it. Jonathan's mind buzzed with 1,000 thoughts as he made his way toward his car, each one tinged with a mixture of triumph and unease. This was his victory, he reminded himself, but he couldn't ignore the lurking sense of danger. For weeks now, he had been receiving vague, thinly veiled threats, anonymous phone calls late at night, unmarked envelopes left on his doorstep, each containing a single line, "Stay in your lane." He had learned to brush off these warnings over the years, but something felt different this time. He knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, and there was no turning back. As he approached his car, he tightened his grip on the briefcase, glancing around the darkened lot. The faint hum of the streetlights was the only sound, an eerie reminder of how alone he truly was. He paused, allowing his eyes to scan the street, his instincts on high alert. That was when he noticed it. A black sedan parked across the street. It hadn't been there earlier, and while he couldn't see inside, he felt a chill run down his spine. He had been through enough encounters with law enforcement to recognize when he was being watched. Jonathan's pulse quickened, but he kept his pace steady, refusing to show any sign of fear. He unlocked his car, placed the briefcase carefully on the passenger seat, and slid into the driver's seat, feeling the familiar comfort of his worn-out car. The engine rumbled to life as he turned the key, the radio automatically tuning into a local jazz station. Soft, smooth melodies filled the car, a stark contrast to the unease building in his chest. He hadn't driven more than a block when he noticed the sedan's headlights flash to life in his rearview mirror. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he took a deep breath, focusing on the road ahead. This wasn't the first time he'd been followed, he reminded himself, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But tonight felt different. He could feel it in the way his hands shook slightly, in the tension building at the base of his spine. The stakes were higher, and he knew that if he let fear get the better of him, everything he had worked for could be lost. Determined, Jonathan drove on, the familiar streets of his neighborhood rolling by as he made his way home. He thought about Maria, his wife of nearly 30 years, who was likely waiting for him with a worried expression. She had always been his rock, the one person who understood the depth of his fight. Tonight, though, he couldn't risk leading this car back to her. He had to find a way to lose his tail before he could even think about going home. After a few minutes of winding through quiet streets, he glanced in the mirror and noticed the sedan was still there. Following his every move, he made a quick decision. Turning onto a narrow side street lined with houses and dim porch lights, the darkness seemed to press in around him as he made another sharp turn, weaving through the neighborhood in an attempt to shake his pursuer. His mind raced as he thought through his options. He could call someone, maybe even a friend on the city council, but that would only bring more attention to the situation. He couldn't risk drawing more people into this, not when he was so close to bringing justice to his community. No, he had to handle this on his own. With one final turn, Jonathan found himself heading toward an old industrial area on the outskirts of town. The buildings here were relics of the city's manufacturing past. Abandoned warehouses with crumbling brick walls and rusted metal doors. He knew this area well. It was a place that most people avoided. A place where he could disappear if he needed to. Pulling his car to a stop near a half-hidden alleyway, he watched as the sedan slowed, its headlights still trained on him. For a moment, he felt a surge of fear, raw and electric, but he pushed it down, focusing on the weight of the briefcase beside him. This was what he had fought for, what he had sacrificed so much for. He couldn't give up now, not when he was so close to exposing the truth. As he stepped out of the car, the night air hit him like a wall, thick and stifling. He glanced back at the dark sedan, taking one last look before slipping into the shadows of the abandoned buildings. This was his fight, and he wasn't going to let anyone stop him. Not now, not ever. Jonathan's heartbeat pounded in his ears as he made his way through the industrial district's dimly lit alleyways, his body tense and every instinct on edge. The abandoned warehouses loomed around him, casting long, ominous shadows across the cracked pavement. The streetlights here were sparse, many flickering weakly or dead altogether, leaving large stretches of the area in complete darkness. It was the kind of place most people wouldn't venture after dark. And for good reason. But Jonathan wasn't most people. And tonight, he needed the cover. He kept glancing over his shoulder, every nerve in his body alert to the faint sounds in the distance. Somewhere behind him, the low hum of the black sedan's engine echoed against the warehouse walls. He could just make out the glow of its headlights sweeping across the street as it slowly crawled forward. Hunting him, felt less like a car and more like a predator stalking its prey. Jonathan's grip tightened around the briefcase in his hand. Inside were months of work, hours spent gathering documents, securing testimonies, and piecing together the hidden network of corruption within the city's police department. Everything he had worked for was in this briefcase, everything that could finally reveal the truth. And now, it was also everything that marked him as a target. As he moved deeper into the shadows, he mentally reviewed his options. Calling the police was out of the question. He knew all too well that the people who would answer were the very ones trying to silence him. Even here, surrounded by cold concrete and rusted metal, he could feel the weight of their presence, their unseen eyes watching his every move. The city was their territory, and tonight, he was the outsider. Jonathan slipped into a narrow alley that cut between two warehouses, pressing himself against the wall as he watched the street. His breath came in shallow bursts, his mind racing with the gravity of his situation. He wasn't easily rattled. Years of activism had hardened him to the risks. He'd been followed before, threatened countless times. But something about tonight felt different, more calculated, more dangerous. The sedan's headlights cut through the dark as it slowly passed the alley where he hid. Jonathan held his breath, his heart hammering as the car paused just a few feet away, its engine rumbling. Through the tinted windows, he could make out two figures inside. He couldn't see their faces, but he didn't need to. He knew who they were, or at least what they represented. He'd spent enough time collecting evidence against people like them to recognize their methods. They were here to send a message, one written in threats and intimidation. The car lingered for a moment, its engine revving softly, as if taunting him. Jonathan clenched his fists, the familiar burn of defiance sparking in his chest. He wouldn't let them scare him, not after all he'd been through. But just as he thought they might drive off, the car's headlights dimmed, and the driver turned off the engine. A cold wave of dread washed over Jonathan. This wasn't just a warning, they were getting out. He watched as the driver's door opened, and a tall figure stepped out, silhouetted against the streetlight. The man's movements were slow, deliberate, and Jonathan could sense the confidence in every step. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew his target was cornered. A second man joined him, shorter but stockier, his stance exuding the same air of unchecked authority. Jonathan's mind raced, his instincts screaming at him to move, to run, but he forced himself to stay still. He had learned long ago that sometimes survival depended on waiting for the right moment. Every second he could delay them was another second he could think, could plan. "Blake!" one of the men called out, his voice echoing through the empty alley. The tone was mocking, laced with a smugness that set Jonathan's teeth on edge. They knew he was here. They wanted him to know they weren't in a hurry. "Come on out," the man continued, his voice smooth and controlled. "We just want to talk." Jonathan's jaw clenched, his mind working at a frantic pace. He knew there was no reasoning with men like these. Men who operated under the false protection of their badges, who wore the shield of authority as a license to silence anyone who threatened their power. For them, He wasn't just a man, he was a threat. A piece of evidence they needed to eliminate. He took a slow step back, his eyes darting around the alley, searching for anything he could use to his advantage. His gaze landed on an old stack of wooden pallets leaning against the wall. If he could create a distraction, even just for a moment, he might have a chance to slip away and make it back to his car. But as he weighed his options, the second man spoke, his tone harsher, lacking the pretense of patience. "Blake, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just come out, and we can settle this quietly. You don't want things to get messy." The implication was clear, and Jonathan felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. For too long, men like them had used threats and violence to maintain their control, to silence anyone who dared to stand up against them. But he wasn't about to become another one of their victims. He had come too far to back down now. Steeling himself, Jonathan took a deep breath and reached for the stack of pallets. His fingers closing around a loose board, he pulled it free as quietly as he could, feeling the rough wood bite into his palms. It wasn't much, but it was something. He would have to be fast, precise, and lucky. There wasn't room for error. Just as he was about to make his move, a flash of movement caught his eye. The first man had turned his back to him, scanning the street with an air of boredom. The second man, however, was still facing the alley, his gaze searching the shadows. Jonathan knew he had to act now before they got any closer. He took a step forward, ready to throw the board toward the street to create a diversion. But the sound of a distant siren suddenly pierced the silence, growing louder with every second. Both men stiffened, their attention snapping toward the sound. Jonathan felt a wave of relief wash over him. His chance had come. Without wasting another second, he threw the board as hard as he could down the alley, the sound of wood clattering against concrete echoing through the night. The two men reacted immediately, turning toward the noise, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Seizing the moment, Jonathan slipped out of the alley, keeping low as he darted between the shadows of the warehouses. His breath came in short, quiet gasps as he moved, his every sense attuned to the danger around him. He could hear the men shouting behind him, their voices harsh and laced with frustration as they realized he had slipped away. He didn't stop to look back. Instead, he focused on putting as much distance between himself and the black sedan as he could. The warehouse district was a maze, but he knew its layout well. He had grown up in this city, walked these streets for years, and he used every shortcut, every hidden path he could remember to stay ahead of them. As he rounded a corner, he spotted his car parked where he had left it, the briefcase still on the passenger seat. Relief flooded through him, but he knew he couldn't relax yet. He had to get out of here before they caught up with him. Jonathan slid into the driver's seat, his hands shaking slightly as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he shifted into gear, peeling out of the lot with a screech of tires. His heart was pounding, his mind racing as he sped down the empty streets, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. The dark sedan appeared seconds later, its headlights blazing as it barreled after him. Jonathan gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he pushed the car faster, navigating the familiar streets with practiced ease. This wasn't over. He knew that much. They wouldn't give up so easily, not with so much at stake. As he drove, his thoughts returned to the briefcase beside him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had risked, was contained within its worn leather walls. And as long as he held onto it, he held the power to change everything. This was his fight, and no matter how dark the night, he was ready to see it through. Jonathan's car shot through the narrow streets, the dark sedan trailing behind like a silent shadow. The empty cityscape around him blurred as he accelerated, pushing his car faster than he'd driven in years. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other gripping the briefcase on the passenger seat, his lifeline and burden all in one. The sedan followed at a steady pace, its headlights glaring in his rearview mirror. He had a hunch that the men inside weren't just intent on scaring him. These weren't idle threats, they were moving with purpose, with a deadly resolve that only grew more evident as they refused to back off. Weaving through the streets with precision, Jonathan took a deep breath, his mind racing with a mixture of fear and focus. He knew these streets well. He'd spent years navigating them for community meetings, events, and protests, but tonight, they took on an eerie unfamiliarity as he wove through alleys and side streets in an effort to lose the sedan. Every turn felt like a gamble, and he knew he couldn't afford to make a single mistake. He made a sharp right, taking him down a narrow lane that cut through a row of old, forgotten shops. The faded signs and boarded-up windows stood as a silent witness to his flight. His tires skidded slightly, but he regained control, urging his car forward. The sedan, however, didn't miss a beat. its headlights flickering at the end of the lane as it followed him relentlessly. "Come on, come on," he muttered to himself, trying to stay calm as he planned his next move. He knew he couldn't just keep running aimlessly. He needed to get somewhere familiar, somewhere he could outmaneuver them. His mind flashed to an old industrial area on the edge of town, a place filled with abandoned warehouses and empty lots. It was risky, but it was his best chance. Jonathan sped through a quiet intersection, his mind laser-focused as he mapped out his route. He glanced at the rearview mirror, noting how close the sedan had gotten. They were gaining on him, and the reality of that fact sent a surge of determination through him. He couldn't let them close the distance. He had too much to protect, too much riding on his survival tonight. He slammed on the gas, his car lurching forward as he sped down a straight stretch of road. His eyes flicked to the mirror again, watching as the sedan followed, steady and unyielding. Whoever was behind him wasn't just any pursuer. They were experienced, professionals maybe, operating with a cool-headed determination that only served to heighten Jonathan's resolve. As he approached the industrial district, the surroundings changed, becoming darker, more desolate. The faint lights of the main streets were left behind, replaced by a near-total darkness broken only by the occasional flickering streetlight. Jonathan took another hard right, entering the maze of warehouses that lined the district's edge. His car's headlights cast eerie shadows against the walls, illuminating patches of graffiti and overgrown weeds poking through cracked pavement. He made a quick left, then another right, threading through the alleys as fast as he dared. He was counting on the familiarity of the layout to buy him some time, to confuse his pursuers if only for a few precious seconds. But as he rounded another corner, he caught sight of the sedan in the mirror. It was still there, unwavering in its pursuit, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Jonathan's grip tightened on the wheel, his mind racing as he tried to think of his next move. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. The car would overheat, or worse, they'd force him into a dead end. The industrial district was full of narrow alleys and dead ends, and he couldn't afford to make a wrong turn. The weight of the briefcase pressed against his thigh, a stark reminder of what he was protecting. Taking a deep breath, he made another sharp turn, entering a wide alley that ran between two large warehouses. It was barely wide enough for two cars to pass, and he used that to his advantage, hugging the left side as he sped through, forcing the sedan to trail behind at a cautious distance. As he reached the end of the alley, he caught sight of a narrow service road up ahead. It was risky, but he knew he had to take it. With a quick jerk of the wheel, Jonathan veered onto the service road, his tires screeching as he maneuvered through the tight space. He knew this route would bring him closer to the warehouse district's far end, closer to the heart of the maze. It was risky, but if he could just get enough distance between him and the sedan, he might have a chance to slip away undetected. He pushed his car harder, the engine rumbling as it responded to his commands. The headlights of the sedan disappeared momentarily in his mirror as he twisted through a series of narrow turns. But he knew they wouldn't be far behind. The sense of urgency surged in his veins, propelling him forward, deeper into the maze. Finally, he spotted an opening, a small, narrow driveway tucked between two warehouses that led to an empty lot. He swerved into it, quickly killing his lights as he brought the car to a halt behind a stack of rusted metal containers. The sound of his own breathing filled the silence as he cut the engine, his heart pounding as he waited, hidden in the shadows. Seconds later, he heard the sedan approaching, its headlights sweeping across the lot as it slowed, its engine idling as it came to a stop nearby. Jonathan stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe as he watched from the shadows. The two men inside the sedan were likely assessing the area, searching for any sign of him. His heart pounded as he crouched lower, gripping the handle of his briefcase tightly. He knew he couldn't stay here for long. Sooner or later, they would figure out he was hiding, and they'd close in. But for now, he had the advantage, if only by a sliver. The men in the sedan seemed to be deliberating, their voices faint and muffled through the car windows. Jonathan couldn't make out what they were saying, but he could see their silhouettes, tense and alert, scanning the area with a practiced eye. Slowly, he backed away from his car, moving deeper into the shadows behind the stack of containers. He needed to put as much distance as possible between himself and the sedan without giving away his position. As he edged further into the shadows, he glanced around, searching for an escape route. He spotted a side door on one of the warehouses, partially obscured by debris. It wasn't much, but it was a way out. He took a steadying breath, gathering his courage. He couldn't afford to hesitate, keeping his movements slow and controlled. He slipped toward the door, his senses on high alert as he approached. Behind him, he could still hear the faint hum of the sedan's engine, the muffled sound of the men's voices as they continued their search. Reaching the door, he gave it a gentle push, relieved when it opened with a low creak. He stepped inside, quickly shutting it behind him. The warehouse was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of dust and rusted metal. His footsteps echoed against the concrete floor as he moved through the shadows, his mind racing as he tried to think of his next move. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to focus. He was hidden, at least temporarily, but he knew it wouldn't last. Sooner or later, they'd realize he had slipped inside, and they'd come looking. He needed to find a way out, another exit that would put him back on the streets, away from the sedan and the men hunting him. The warehouse was a cavernous space, filled with stacks of old crates and machinery left to rust. The faint glow from a broken window cast eerie shadows across the floor, illuminating a narrow pathway that led toward the back. Jonathan followed it, his every step careful and quiet, his ears straining for any sound that might indicate he had been discovered. As he reached the far end of the warehouse, he spotted a small, broken window near the ground, just large enough for him to slip through. He crouched down, testing the edges before easing himself out, landing softly on the gravel outside. Taking a moment to steady himself, he looked around, the night air cool against his face. The industrial district stretched out before him, a labyrinth of shadows and silent buildings. But this time, he had the advantage. He knew the layout, the routes and pathways that could lead him to safety. And now, with a final burst of determination, he set off, weaving through the darkness toward freedom. Behind him, the sounds of the sedan faded, leaving only the echo of his footsteps as he disappeared into the night. The briefcase clutched tightly to his chest. The silence of the night settled heavily over the warehouse district as Jonathan moved deeper into the shadows, his footsteps soft but steady. Inside the warehouse, the air was damp and thick, carrying the musty scent of rust and decay. Every noise seemed amplified, from the faint creak of his shoes on the cracked concrete to the occasional distant rumble of a car passing on a far-off street. Jonathan could feel the weight of his pursuers nearby, pressing down on him like a thick fog. He had managed to slip out of sight, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they found him. His gaze swept across the dimly lit space, noting the scattered piles of crates and rusted machinery that offered the scantest cover. In the corners, cobwebs hung like tattered curtains, abandoned in the shadows of a place long forgotten. The space around him was vast, yet claustrophobic, each darkened corner hiding its own secrets. Jonathan's heart thudded steadily in his chest as he tried to formulate a plan. He knew he was outnumbered, and the men outside were undoubtedly armed. But he couldn't afford to panic. Not now. A sharp metallic clink echoed through the warehouse as the main entrance creaked open, bathing the floor in a sliver of dim, pale light. Jonathan pressed himself back against a stack of crates, barely daring to breathe as he watched two figures step inside. His stomach tightened as he recognized them. Baker and Randolph, two officers whose names and faces had appeared in his files more times than he could count. They weren't just corrupt. They were deeply embedded in the very system he was trying to expose. Men with power and nothing to lose. Baker was tall and lean, with a hardened expression that betrayed years of unchecked authority. His every move radiated arrogance, from the casual way he held his gun to the way he scanned the room, as though he owned it. Randolph, on the other hand, was stockier, his posture tense and predatory. His eyes flickered with barely restrained anger, his fists clenched as if itching for a fight. "Blake!" Baker's voice rang out, slicing through the silence. It was calm, almost mocking, as if he were addressing a mischievous child who had simply wandered too far from home. "We know you're in here. Let's make this easy on everyone and come out. No need for things to get messy." Jonathan's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around the briefcase. The evidence inside was everything he had worked for, his leverage, his lifeline, and the reason he was in this position. He knew he couldn't let them take it, but he also knew that stepping out now would mean certain death. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to silence him for good. Randolph took a step forward, his eyes scanning the room with a cold, calculating gaze. "Blake!" he called, his tone edged with impatience. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're just here to have a little chat." The sick irony in his voice sent a chill down Jonathan's spine. He could feel their confidence, the sense of power that came from years of operating with impunity. Men like Baker and Randolph weren't afraid of consequences. They had sidestepped them for years. For them, this was just another night, another problem to erase. Jonathan pressed himself further into the shadows, weighing his options. The dim lighting cast distorted shadows across the floor, and he knew if he stayed low, he could remain hidden for a while longer. But he also knew he couldn't simply wait them out. His mind raced, searching for a way to turn the situation to his advantage. Slowly, he scanned the room, his gaze landing on a rusted metal pipe lying just a few feet away. It wasn't much, but it was something. He reached for it, his fingers closing around the cold metal as he steadied his breath. If he could create a distraction, even momentarily, he might have a chance to slip away. "Come on, Blake," Baker called out, his tone shifting to one of impatience. "You're not making this easy on us. Just show yourself, and we can talk this through." Jonathan gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body tensed with a mixture of fear and defiance. He had spent his life fighting for justice, facing down bullies in positions of power. But this was different. These men weren't just using words to intimidate him. They were armed, ready, and willing to kill. He took a deep breath, his mind sharpening as he assessed his options. He could hear their footsteps now, drawing closer, their boots scraping against the concrete floor. The narrow corridor he had used to slip deeper into the warehouse loomed ahead. But it was a dead end. If they followed him in, he'd be trapped. Suddenly, Randolph spoke again, his voice low and filled with contempt. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you, Blake? Think this little crusade of yours will change anything? You're a fool if you believe that. You'll be dead, and we'll still be here, running things like we always have." Jonathan felt a surge of anger bubble up, momentarily drowning out his fear. He tightened his grip on the pipe, his knuckles turning white as he steadied himself. He wasn't a fool. He was a man standing up for what was right, and he'd be damned if he let men like them intimidate him into submission. As their footsteps drew closer, Jonathan knew he had only one chance. He waited, his muscles coiled like a spring, every sense attuned to their movements. He could hear the faint creak of the floorboards beneath their feet, the subtle shift of their weight as they moved in his direction. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, he sprang from his hiding place, swinging the pipe with all his strength. The metal connected with Baker's arm in a sickening crack, sending his gun flying across the floor. The shock registered in Baker's face for only a split second before it twisted into rage. Before Jonathan could make another move, Randolph lunged forward, slamming into him with the force of a freight train. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a brief moment, everything went black. He felt the cold, unforgiving concrete against his face, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth as he struggled to regain his bearings. Randolph pressed a knee into his back, pinning him down with a brutal efficiency that spoke of years of practice. Jonathan struggled, his vision swimming as he fought to break free, but Randolph's weight was too much. He could feel the man's breath hot against his ear, his voice dripping with venom as he spoke. "You really thought you could take us down?" Randolph sneered, his tone laced with a cruel amusement. "You're nothing, Blake. You hear me? Nothing." Jonathan gritted his teeth, every ounce of strength focused on resisting the urge to cry out. He refused to give them the satisfaction. Even as pain radiated through his body, he could hear Baker's footsteps approaching, the scuff of his boots against the concrete as he retrieved his gun. "You had to make this difficult, didn't you?" Baker's voice was tight with fury as he stood over Jonathan, his gun aimed directly at him. "We could have ended this quietly. But no, you had to make it hard." Jonathan's mind raced, desperation clawing at his every thought. He had to think of something, anything to shift the balance. But his options were slipping away. He could feel the cold weight of defeat settling over him, suffocating and final. But just as all hope seemed lost, a faint sound pierced the silence, the distant rumble of a car engine. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat, the noise barely registering through the haze of pain and fear. The headlights cast a faint glow through the warehouse's broken windows. And in that moment, Jonathan realized he wasn't alone. Baker and Randolph exchanged glances, their faces darkening with frustration as they registered the sound. They hadn't anticipated anyone else showing up. Jonathan felt a flicker of hope ignite within him, a sliver of possibility breaking through the darkness. As the footsteps outside grew closer, Jonathan clung to that hope, his mind whirring as he tried to piece together a plan. He knew he couldn't afford to wait any longer. The arrival of the new vehicle had shifted the dynamic, and it was the only advantage he had left. Randolph leaned down, his voice low and menacing. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. This ends here." But Jonathan wasn't listening. His focus had already shifted to the faint glint of light coming through the doorway, the sounds of footsteps approaching with purpose and authority. He didn't know who it was or what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to go down without a fight. And as the warehouse filled with the tension of unspoken threats, Jonathan knew that the night was far from over. Jonathan lay on the cold concrete floor, his body aching from the brutal scuffle with Randolph and Baker. Every breath he took sent sharp, jarring waves of pain through his chest. But he forced himself to remain calm, focusing on the sliver of light spilling in through the warehouse door. It wasn't just the pain that kept him grounded. Though no. It was the sound of footsteps approaching, each one steady, deliberate, and, most importantly, unfamiliar to Baker and Randolph. He strained to turn his head just enough to glimpse the figure moving toward them. Through the dim light, he could make out a man, tall and broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the headlights of an SUV parked just outside. The figure stepped closer, and as he did, a faint but familiar face emerged from the shadows. It was Chris Harper. Jonathan's heart leapt at the sight of his old friend. Though he struggled to hide his surprise, Chris had been one of his closest allies in their early years of activism. A man who shared Jonathan's passion for justice but chose a different path, working behind the scenes within law enforcement. It had been years since they'd last spoken, each lost to their own battles. But in that moment, Jonathan couldn't have been more relieved to see him. Chris took another step forward, his face set in a mask of calm but unwavering authority. He was dressed casually, in dark jeans and a leather jacket, but he moved with a quiet confidence that demanded attention. His gaze settled on Baker and Randolph, his expression unreadable. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Chris said, his voice steady and measured. He took a step closer, his eyes cold and assessing as he met Baker's gaze. Baker's face twisted in confusion and anger, his gun still trained on Jonathan. "And who the hell are you?" he snapped, his tone brimming with hostility. "This isn't your business. Walk away." Chris took another step forward, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "It is my business," he replied smoothly. "You see, I've been watching you two for a while now." Jonathan's breath hitched. Watching them? He hadn't known Chris was even still in the game, let alone working an investigation this close to home. But as he looked up at his friend, a faint flicker of understanding dawned. Chris wasn't just any cop. He was internal affairs. Randolph's face darkened, his grip on Jonathan tightening. "Internal affairs?" he sneered, the words dripping with disdain. "You think that badge means anything here? You're outnumbered, and nobody's coming to back you up." Chris didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his own badge, holding it in plain sight. "I think it means a lot," he said, his tone steely. "And you might want to think twice before making any assumptions." For a moment, there was silence, the tension thickening as Chris and the two officers stared each other down. Jonathan watched, his chest heaving with a mixture of pain and relief as he realized the odds had just shifted in his favor. Baker and Randolph hadn't expected anyone else. They hadn't expected Chris. Baker's eyes narrowed, his posture rigid as he assessed Chris. The gun in his hand twitched, his knuckles white as he struggled to maintain his composure. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. Chris's gaze didn't waver. "I know exactly what I'm getting into. I've spent the last year building a case against you, Randolph, and the network you're a part of." His voice was calm but sharp, each word landing with the weight of a promise. "So you have two choices. Put down your weapons and come quietly, or make this a whole lot harder on yourselves." Jonathan watched as Baker and Randolph exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. He could see the fear in their eyes, the dawning realization that they were no longer in control. The arrogance they'd displayed moments ago had evaporated, replaced by a quiet fury and frustration. Randolph shifted his weight, his hand moving toward his holster. "You think you can just waltz in here and take us down?" he spat, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You're alone. No backup. No leverage. We'll walk out of here, and there's nothing you can do to stop us." Chris's expression remained impassive, but Jonathan could see the subtle tension in his stance, the way his shoulders squared in preparation. "I wouldn't count on that," he said softly, his gaze locked on Randolph. With one swift motion, Chris reached into his jacket, producing a small device, a police radio. He pressed the button, and a voice crackled through the speaker. "This is Agent Harper. All units, converge on my location. I repeat, all units, converge." Baker's face drained of color, his gun hand faltering as he realized the extent of Chris's plan. "You son of a—" Chris cut him off, his voice low but firm. "It's over, Baker. You've run your game long enough. But it ends here." He took a step closer, his gaze unyielding. "Drop the gun. Now." For a moment, Baker hesitated, his jaw clenched as he weighed his options. Jonathan held his breath, watching as the officer's face contorted with rage and desperation. But Chris's calm, steady gaze left no room for doubt, no opening for escape. With a growl of frustration, Baker finally released his grip on the gun, letting it clatter to the floor. Randolph followed suit, his shoulders slumping as he glared at Chris with a venomous intensity. "Smart choice," Chris said, his tone even. He kept his gaze on the two men as he spoke into the radio. "We have them secured. Proceed with caution." As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, Jonathan felt a wave of relief wash over him, his body finally relaxing as he allowed himself to breathe. The adrenaline coursing through him had kept the pain at bay, but now it all came rushing back, the bruises and cuts making their presence known with a vengeance. Chris stepped forward, his gaze softening as he looked down at Jonathan. "Are you all right?" Jonathan managed a weak nod, his voice hoarse as he replied. "Better now." He took a shaky breath, clutching the briefcase to his chest. "Thank you, Chris." Chris knelt beside him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You really thought I'd leave you to face this alone?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a note of warmth. "We go back too far for that." Jonathan's chest tightened with gratitude, a sense of solidarity settling over him as he looked at his friend. They may have taken different paths, but tonight, they were united by a shared purpose, a common fight, and in that moment, he felt stronger, knowing he wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse as the first officers arrived, moving to secure Baker and Randolph. Chris gave Jonathan's shoulder a reassuring squeeze before rising to oversee the arrests, his expression hardening as he watched his colleagues handcuff the two corrupt officers. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no second thoughts, only the determination of a man who was willing to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. As Baker and Randolph were led out, heads bowed and expressions grim, Jonathan felt a surge of triumph rise within him. They had won a battle tonight, a victory hard-fought and well-earned. But he knew this was only the beginning. The network of corruption stretched far beyond Baker and Randolph, and there were others who would fight to keep their secrets buried. Chris returned to Jonathan's side, offering him a hand to help him up. "Come on, let's get you looked at," he said, his tone gentle. "You've been through enough for one night." Jonathan took his hand, allowing Chris to pull him to his feet. As they stepped out of the warehouse and into the cool night air, he felt the weight of his briefcase in his hand, a reminder of the evidence he still held, the truth that had yet to be revealed. The night may have been filled with danger and darkness, but in Chris's presence, Jonathan felt a glimmer of hope. They had a long road ahead, filled with challenges and threats, but for the first time, he believed they could make it through. Together, they could expose the truth, bring justice to those who had been wronged, and begin to dismantle the system that had oppressed his community for too long. As the two men walked side by side into the flashing lights of the patrol cars, Jonathan felt the stirrings of resolve ignite within him once more. This fight was far from over, but he wasn't going to back down, not now, not ever. With Chris by his side, he was ready to see it through to the very end. Jonathan sat in the back of the ambulance, his mind swirling with the events that had just unfolded. The adrenaline of the chase, the clash with Baker and Randolph, and the shock of Chris's timely intervention all seemed like a blur. The paramedic was busy checking his vitals, but Jonathan barely registered the pricks and adjustments. His focus was entirely on the distant scene where Baker and Randolph were being led into separate squad cars. Heads down, faces tight with suppressed fury, Chris stood nearby, talking in low tones to one of the officers who had arrived on the scene. The calm authority in Chris's stance was unmistakable, his presence commanding and resolute. Jonathan couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for his old friend, who had risked everything to pull him out of a deadly situation. Chris hadn't just saved his life, he had shifted the entire fight, placing them on the offensive against a network of corruption Jonathan had feared might never be fully exposed. The paramedic's voice broke through his thoughts. "You're lucky, Mr. Blake," she said, offering him a reassuring smile as she wrapped a bandage around his bruised wrist. "Could have been a lot worse." Jonathan gave a brief nod, murmuring his thanks, though his mind was already moving ahead, racing through the pieces of evidence and testimonies he'd gathered over the past year. He was ready to take down Baker and Randolph, but he knew that they were only pawns in a much larger game. Men like them didn't act alone. The people higher up in the chain were the real targets, and it would take every bit of courage and strategy he could muster to bring them to justice. Chris finished his conversation and walked over, his face a mixture of relief and seriousness. He paused next to Jonathan, studying him with a look that was both concerned and resolute. "You hanging in there?" Chris asked, his tone soft. Jonathan managed a wry smile. "Hanging in. It's been a long night." Chris nodded, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Long night doesn't even begin to cover it." He gestured for Jonathan to join him outside the ambulance. "Walk with me for a minute. We have some things to discuss." Jonathan slid off the ambulance seat, nodding at the paramedic in thanks, and followed Chris into the cool night air. They walked a few paces from the flashing lights, seeking a bit of privacy from the officers bustling around the scene. As they reached a quieter area, Chris turned to face him, his expression serious. "This isn't over, Jonathan," Chris began, his voice low. "Baker and Randolph are just the tip of the iceberg. We've known for years that there's a network of corrupt officers covering each other's tracks, protecting each other from scrutiny. Taking these two down is a victory, but it's not the end." Jonathan nodded, his eyes narrowing with determination. "I know," he replied, gripping the briefcase that still held the evidence he'd risked his life to collect. "But tonight, we finally made a dent. For the first time, we have something they can't ignore. Testimonies, recordings, proof that implicates them directly." Chris's gaze drifted to the briefcase, a spark of hope gleaming in his eyes. "You're right, this is more than we've ever had before. But we can't underestimate them. With Baker and Randolph in custody, the rest of the network will be scrambling to cover their tracks. They'll destroy evidence, threaten witnesses, do whatever it takes to protect themselves. We need to move fast and hit them before they have a chance to regroup." Jonathan's jaw tightened, and he nodded. "Then we go public. Take this evidence to the media. Let the community see the truth. We make it impossible for them to bury this." Chris's eyes flickered with approval. "That's exactly what I was thinking. But we need to be strategic. The evidence needs to be airtight, and the public needs to be ready to stand with us. Without the people's support, they'll find a way to twist this against us." Jonathan took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "I've spent years building that trust. They'll stand with us. They've wanted justice as badly as we have." Chris placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder, his grip firm. "Then let's make sure this doesn't stop here. We're in this together, Jonathan, from here to the end." They walked back toward the patrol cars, their purpose clear and unwavering. As they approached, Baker locked eyes with Jonathan, his gaze full of raw, seething hatred. Gone was the arrogance, replaced by a cold, simmering rage that sent a chill through Jonathan's spine. He knew that men like Baker didn't forgive or forget. This wasn't the end of their fight. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. "Enjoy your little victory while it lasts, Blake," Baker spat as he was forced into the squad car, his words laced with venom. "You're playing a game you don't understand." Jonathan met his gaze, unflinching. "No, Baker, it's you who doesn't understand. This is about justice, not power. And I won't stop until every one of you is held accountable." Baker scoffed, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face as the door closed, cutting off his retort. Jonathan watched as the car pulled away, a feeling of satisfaction mingling with the knowledge that their victory tonight was a fragile one. The system they were up against was powerful, deeply rooted, and wouldn't fall easily. But for the first time, Jonathan believed they had a chance to expose the truth. Chris turned to him as the squad car disappeared down the road. "I have a team combing through the evidence you gathered," he said, "and I'll be in touch with the department to start building cases against anyone else involved." Jonathan nodded, the weight of his briefcase a comforting reminder of their next step. "I'll keep working on my end, too. We'll meet with community leaders, build up the momentum. They'll want to see change, and they'll stand behind us." As dawn began to break over the city, Chris and Jonathan exchanged a final nod. It wasn't a farewell but a promise, an acknowledgement that this fight was just beginning. They walked toward their separate vehicles, a silent understanding passing between them. They would continue this journey together, facing down the shadows of corruption, armed with nothing but the truth and their unwavering resolve. Jonathan slipped into his car, setting the briefcase carefully beside him. As he started the engine and pulled away from the scene, he couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose coursing through his veins. Tonight, they had won a small victory, but the real battle lay ahead, and he was ready. Sunlight streamed through the windows of Jonathan's modest home as he sat at his kitchen table. The briefcase and its contents spread out before him. Documents, photos, and audio recordings lay in neat piles, each one a testament to the corruption he'd fought to expose. He had spent the early hours organizing the evidence, sorting through the materials that had nearly cost him his life. But as he sifted through the stacks, his mind kept drifting back to the previous night, the narrow escape, the look of fury on Baker's face, and Chris's steadfast resolve. The house was quiet, the stillness broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the faint sound of birds chirping outside. Jonathan took a deep breath, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the morning air, grounding him in the present. The adrenaline that had carried him through the night was gone, replaced by an ache in his muscles and a weariness that weighed down his every move. Just then, Maria, his wife of nearly 30 years, entered the kitchen. She paused at the doorway, her gaze softening as she took in the sight of him. Bruised and exhausted but alive, she crossed the room, wrapping her arms around his shoulders and pressing a gentle kiss to his temple. "I was so worried," she murmured, her voice laced with relief and lingering fear. "When I heard what happened, I didn't know if you'd be coming home." Jonathan reached up, covering her hand with his own. "I'm sorry, Maria. I didn't want you to be dragged into this. But I had to see it through. We're closer than ever now. And we can't stop." Maria pulled a chair next to him, her eyes filled with the kind of understanding that came only from years of shared struggle. "I know, Jonathan. I've known for years that this fight means everything to you. But promise me you'll be careful. You've done so much already. We need you here too." Jonathan gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, the weight of her words settling over him. He knew the risks he was taking, but he also knew that his fight was far from over. The community needed him, just as much as he needed Maria's support. "Last night was a close call, but it was worth it," he said, gesturing to the documents spread out before them. "We finally have the proof. Maria, everything we need to take down the people who have been hiding behind their badges, using their positions to hurt the very people they're supposed to protect." Maria nodded, her gaze drifting over the evidence. "So, what happens now?" Just as she asked, Jonathan's phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at the screen to see Chris's name flashing. He answered, his voice steady as he greeted his friend. "Jonathan," Chris began, his tone as resolute as ever. "I've spoken to a few key figures in the department and managed to pull in some allies who are ready to stand with us. We're going to push this case forward. But we need to be strategic. The department's trying to keep things under wraps. They want to make it look like Baker and Randolph were just rogue officers. A one-time, isolated incident." Jonathan felt a surge of frustration. Of course they're trying to spin it. But this isn't isolated. "Chris, we both know it runs deeper. They're just afraid of how far we're willing to go to expose them." Chris's voice softened, his tone laced with understanding. "That's exactly why we need to go public. We need to make it impossible for them to sweep this under the rug. But we'll need your community. Jonathan, people need to see that it's not just you and me, that the people who live here, who have suffered, are standing behind us." Jonathan's gaze shifted to Maria, who listened intently, her expression resolute. "I've got their support, Chris. The community is tired of living in fear. They're ready for change." "Good," Chris replied, a note of determination in his voice. "Then let's get to work. I'll handle the legal preparations on my end, and you can focus on gathering community leaders, local reporters, anyone willing to listen. We'll need all the voices we can get." After they exchanged a few more words, Jonathan hung up, a sense of renewed purpose settling over him. He looked at Maria, who nodded, understanding the path he was about to take. "We'll start with the community," she said, her voice steady. "People need to hear this from someone they trust. Once they see you standing up, they'll be there too." Jonathan smiled, gratitude and love welling up within him. Maria's strength and faith had always been his foundation, and now felt more essential than ever. By afternoon, Jonathan had called a meeting at the community center. Familiar faces filled the room, neighbors, activists, friends, and people who had lived through the very injustices he was trying to expose. The air was thick with anticipation, and as Jonathan took his place at the front of the room, he felt the weight of their hope and trust pressing down on him. He began with a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," he started, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Last night, I came close to losing everything in the pursuit of justice. But thanks to the help of an old friend, I'm standing here today, and I'm here to tell you that we have the power to make a change." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Jonathan felt a surge of energy, the familiar spark of community solidarity he'd relied on for years. He held up a file, his voice gaining strength. "I have evidence, proof of the corruption that has been destroying our neighborhoods for too long. These are real people, real officers, who have abused their power to hurt us. But with your support, we're going to make sure they're held accountable. We're going to let the city know that we won't be silenced." Applause filled the room, the sound echoing off the walls, and Jonathan felt a wave of pride and resolve wash over him. He spent the next hour outlining the steps they would take, urging them to contact local reporters, share the story on social media, and organize demonstrations to keep the pressure on. Every person in the room was given a task, a role to play in spreading the word and demanding justice. When the meeting concluded, the crowd dispersed, buzzing with purpose and determination. Jonathan stayed behind, tidying up and reflecting on the enormity of what they were attempting to accomplish. But he wasn't alone for long. Chris arrived, his expression both weary and hopeful. "You did good, Jonathan," Chris said, patting his friend on the back. "This is how change begins, with the people." Jonathan nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We're not just two men against the world anymore. We're an entire community, and we're not backing down." Chris glanced around the now empty room, a sense of reverence in his gaze. "And with the media's attention, the department won't be able to hide. Every move they make will be watched." Jonathan felt a surge of gratitude for Chris, the man who had risked his career to stand by his side, to fight for justice when others had turned a blind eye. They had come full circle, from young activists to men who had seen the worst of the system, only to come out stronger on the other side. "Thank you, Chris," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Chris shook his head, his gaze steady. "No, Jonathan, you've been fighting this fight long before I ever showed up. I'm just glad I can stand beside you now." As they left the community center together, the weight of their mission settled over them, a responsibility they both embraced. The battle would be long, and they would face powerful enemies willing to protect their secrets at any cost. But with the community at their side, Jonathan felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. And as they stepped into the light of a new day, Jonathan knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they were finally on the path to true justice. Jonathan stood at the front steps of City Hall, his gaze sweeping over the growing crowd gathered before him. The square was alive with voices, murmurs of anticipation rippling through the air as people shifted, clutching homemade signs and banners. Words like justice, accountability, and truth were scrawled across the posters, a testament to the anger and determination that had brought them here. Beside him, Chris adjusted the microphone at the podium, his face calm but resolute. Around them, community leaders, journalists, activists, and families who had experienced the sting of injustice stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a wall of support that filled Jonathan with an overwhelming sense of pride and gratitude. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It belonged to everyone gathered here, to every person who had suffered, and to those who had come to demand change. As Jonathan stepped up to the microphone, a hush fell over the crowd, a collective silence as hundreds of pairs of eyes focused on him. He cleared his throat, gathering his thoughts as he held the briefcase in his hand, a symbol of the truth they were here to unveil. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice carrying across the square with a calm, determined strength. "We stand together, not just for ourselves, but for every person who has been wronged by the very people sworn to protect us. Today, we are here to say enough is enough. No more secrets, no more lies, no more corruption hidden behind badges." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd, punctuated by nods and murmurs of support. Jonathan felt the weight of their expectation and pressed on, holding up the briefcase. "In this case," he continued, "are documents, recordings, and testimonies, proof of a system that has turned a blind eye to injustice for far too long. We have evidence of officers abusing their power, of people in high places covering up crimes, of families torn apart and lives forever changed. This isn't just a story, it's our lives." Jonathan's voice grew stronger, fueled by the crowd's energy and his own unbreakable resolve. "We are here to demand that the city, the police department, and every person in power who knew of these crimes be held accountable. We will not be silenced, and we will not back down." Applause erupted from the crowd, a surge of applause and cheers echoing against the city walls. Jonathan felt a thrill of hope rise within him, the sound of unity and strength lifting him above the exhaustion that had been weighing him down for days. He glanced at Chris, who gave him an encouraging nod before stepping up to the podium. "As an agent with internal affairs, I've spent months building a case to expose these corrupt officers," Chris began, his voice calm and authoritative. "But I stand here today as your ally, a man who believes in justice and the power of the people. We will take this to every level necessary until justice is served." The crowd's response was immediate, a rallying cry that resonated with the deep-seated anger and frustration felt by so many. Jonathan felt Maria's hand on his shoulder, a steadying presence as he watched the faces around him, faces filled with hope and belief in the possibility of real change. Suddenly, a familiar figure pushed through the crowd, a reporter from a local news station, microphone in hand. She caught Jonathan's eye, her expression urgent as she made her way toward the podium. He recognized her as Sarah Thompson, an investigative journalist known for her fearless coverage of city corruption. She had reported on many issues in the past, but Jonathan had never seen her this impassioned. "Jonathan," Can we get a statement? She called out, her voice carrying over the crowd. What are you hoping to achieve with this evidence? Jonathan stepped forward, welcoming her question. We're here to achieve accountability, Sarah, he said, his tone steady. This evidence isn't just a collection of facts. It's a call for justice. For every person who has been affected by corruption. We want full transparency from the police department and immediate action taken against every officer involved. Sarah nodded, her expression serious as she held the microphone closer. And do you believe this will be enough to bring real change? There have been investigations before. But the system always seems to protect its own. Jonathan felt the weight of her words settle over him. A reminder of the countless setbacks he'd faced over the years. But as he looked out over the crowd, he found his answer. Yes, I believe it will, he said firmly, because this time, we're not just fighting for change. We are the change. We're standing together, united and unwilling to let this be swept under the rug again. We have the truth, and we're not letting it go. The crowd roared in agreement, fists raised, voices calling out in solidarity. Jonathan felt an almost electric energy spread through the square, the undeniable power of unity fueling him as he faced the gathered supporters. This was more than just a rally, it was a movement, one that had been building for years, a collective outcry from a community that had endured too much and was ready to demand justice. Chris stepped up beside Jonathan, his voice low but intense. The media is picking this up across the city. We're being watched. Jonathan, they can't ignore us now. Jonathan nodded, feeling a sense of both urgency and triumph. This was exactly what they had hoped for. Public attention. The eyes of the city turned on their cause. He knew it would put pressure on those in power, forcing them to respond or risk losing their legitimacy. Just then, a voice boomed over the loudspeakers. Jonathan recognized the mayor's voice, her tone cautious but firm as she addressed the gathering. We hear you, she began, the words crackling through the speakers. I understand the concerns you have, and I acknowledge that mistakes have been made. We are committed to a full investigation and to ensuring accountability within our police department. I promise you that justice will be served. A ripple of skepticism ran through the crowd, and Jonathan could feel their collective doubt. It was no secret that promises had been made before. Promises that had faded in the face of bureaucracy and political interests. Jonathan seized the moment, stepping back to the microphone. Mayor, with all due respect, we don't want promises. We want action. We want you to address this publicly, to commit to real change, not just words. The crowd cheered, their approval resounding as the mayor's voice faltered for a brief moment. Jonathan could sense the shift, the crack in the usual defenses as she struggled to respond. This is about transparency and rebuilding trust, she replied, her voice losing some of its certainty. We are working to make real changes, and we ask for your patience as we. Jonathan interrupted, his voice strong and clear. With all due respect, we've been patient long enough. It's time for results. The crowd's cheers intensified, their chants filling the air, an unstoppable force of unity and defiance. Jonathan felt the ground beneath him shift, the sense of possibility becoming tangible as he looked out over the sea of faces, each one a reminder of the lives affected by the system he was fighting against. After a few more tense exchanges, the mayor relented, her tone subdued. I will ensure that immediate steps are taken to address these issues, she promised, her voice barely audible over the cheers. Jonathan turned to Chris, a small smile breaking through his otherwise stoic expression. We're getting through, he murmured. They can't ignore us anymore. Chris nodded, his face solemn. This is just the beginning, Jonathan. They'll try to sidestep, to minimize, to turn this against us. But if we keep the pressure on, if we hold them accountable every step of the way, we can force their hand. Jonathan's resolve only strengthened as he looked at his friend, the weight of their shared mission settling over him like armor. He knew the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, with attempts to discredit and derail their cause. But with the strength of the community beside him, he felt invincible. As the rally came to an end, Jonathan and Chris stayed behind, watching as people slowly dispersed, conversations buzzing with hope and determination. A few lingered to thank him, their gratitude humbling him as they shared their own stories of struggle and resilience. Keep fighting, an older woman whispered, her hand gripping his tightly. We're all counting on you. Jonathan nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of duty and resolve. He was no longer just one man fighting for justice. He was part of something bigger, a force that could no longer be ignored. And as he left City Hall that day, he knew that he would carry their voices with him, each one a reminder of the strength and resilience that could change the world. Jonathan sat in his living room, surrounded by stacks of documents and files. His laptop opened to a glowing screen filled with media contact information. The walls seemed to hum with the tension and anticipation that had been building all week. It had been days since the rally at City Hall, and public interest had only grown. Every news outlet in the city had picked up the story, and Jonathan's phone buzzed with new calls and messages every few minutes. Journalists wanted interviews. Community leaders wanted meetings. Supporters flooded social media, demanding answers from the city and the police department. The outcry had taken on a life of its own. For the first time in his life, Jonathan felt that the truth might actually prevail, and that those who had wielded power over others unjustly would finally be held accountable. But he knew this was just the beginning. Chris arrived just after noon, looking as weary as Jonathan felt, but with a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He dropped into a chair across from Jonathan and ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. "We've got momentum," Chris said, breaking the silence. "The department is feeling the pressure. They're releasing statements about an internal investigation. But we both know what that means." Jonathan scoffed, shaking his head. "It's damage control. They'll investigate, but only as far as it takes to protect the people at the top. They'll make Baker and Randolph the scapegoats and say the problem is solved." Chris nodded, his jaw tightening. "That's exactly why we can't let up now. We have to keep pushing. Make it impossible for them to do anything less than a full overhaul. We have the public on our side, but we need to turn that pressure into results." Jonathan glanced at the documents spread across the table, feeling the familiar fire of determination burn within him. "I've lined up interviews with a few major outlets," he said, tapping a notebook filled with dates and times. "We're going to lay it all out, the evidence, the testimonies, the full scope of what's been going on." Chris's gaze was unwavering, his eyes fixed on Jonathan with a mixture of admiration and conviction. "Good, and we'll get statements from victims, families, and anyone willing to share their story. The more people see the real impact of this corruption, the harder it will be for the department to cover their tracks." Jonathan took a deep breath, the weight of their mission settling heavily on his shoulders. "They're going to fight back, Chris. They'll discredit us, spin the narrative however they can. I just hope we're ready." Chris leaned forward, his voice steady. "We are ready, and we're not alone. The community is with us. The public is with us. This isn't just our fight anymore. It's theirs, too." Jonathan nodded, a spark of hope igniting within him. For so long, he had felt like he was fighting a lonely battle, his voice drowned out by the weight of a system that seemed unbreakable. But now, with Chris by his side and the full force of the community behind them, he felt stronger than ever. They spent the afternoon preparing, going over each piece of evidence, organizing documents, and planning their statements. Jonathan's mind raced with details, piecing together the story they would share with the world. They needed to expose the whole picture, the layers of corruption, the network of officers covering for each other, the families who had suffered in silence. As evening approached, Jonathan received a call from Sarah Thompson, the journalist who had attended the rally. She was eager to help tell their story, and her reputation for fearlessly exposing corruption made her a valuable ally. "Jonathan," she greeted him, her voice alive with energy. "I've got a primetime slot on the local news tomorrow night. I want you and Chris to come on air, share what you found, and let the public know exactly what's been going on." Jonathan's pulse quickened. "Are you sure? This is going to be messy. There's a lot at stake, and they'll come after us hard." "Let them try," Sarah replied, her voice filled with conviction. "The truth needs to come out, and people deserve to hear it. We can't let them bury this story. Not when we're this close to exposing the whole rotten system." Jonathan glanced at Chris, who nodded in approval. "We'll be there," he promised, a sense of finality in his words. This was it, the moment they'd been working toward for months, the chance to tell the truth in a way that couldn't be silenced. The next day passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Jonathan barely slept, his mind filled with the weight of what they were about to do. But as he arrived at the news studio with Chris, he felt a calm settle over him. This was the right path, and he was ready to face whatever came next. Inside the studio, bright lights shone down on the set, casting a glow over the sleek desk where Sarah sat, microphone in hand, ready to bring their story to life. She greeted Jonathan and Chris with a firm handshake, her eyes filled with resolve. "Let's make sure they can't ignore us," she said, her voice a low whisper of encouragement. Jonathan and Chris took their seats across from her, adjusting their microphones as they glanced around the studio. The room was silent, the tension palpable as the seconds ticked down. And then, the red live light blinked on. Sarah introduced the segment, her voice calm and professional as she set the stage for what was to come. Tonight, we bring you an exclusive story, one that shines a light on corruption, power, and the fight for justice. Joining us are Jonathan Blake, a longtime activist and community leader, and Chris Harper, an internal affairs agent, both of whom have spent months gathering evidence to expose a network of corruption within the city's police department. She turned to Jonathan, her expression serious. "Jonathan, can you tell us how this investigation started and what you've uncovered?" Jonathan took a steadying breath, his voice firm as he began. "For years, our community has suffered under the weight of a system that should protect us, but instead has turned against us. We've seen lives ruined, families torn apart, and too many people afraid to speak out. This investigation started with a few brave individuals who were willing to share their stories, and it's grown into something that reveals a deep-rooted network of corruption within our police department." He held up a file, his gaze unwavering. "In this file are testimonies, recordings, and documents proving that officers within the department have covered for each other, manipulated evidence, and abused their power. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a larger pattern that has gone unchecked for far too long." Sarah's gaze shifted to Chris, her expression unyielding. "Chris, as an internal affairs agent, what have you seen that supports Jonathan's claims?" Chris leaned forward, his tone measured and direct. "I've seen enough to know that this isn't just a few bad apples. This is a system that has been allowed to rot from the inside out. The evidence we've gathered shows officers protecting each other, intimidating witnesses, and systematically covering up misconduct. This isn't a coincidence. It's an organized effort to keep the truth hidden." The screen displayed images of the documents and recordings they'd collected, the camera zooming in on the incriminating details. Each piece of evidence was a testament to the suffering, the betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of justice. As the segment continued, Jonathan felt the weight of their story reverberate through the studio. The silence was thick, the truth laid bare for everyone watching. And as Sarah closed the segment, her final words echoed through the air, leaving no room for doubt. "The evidence speaks for itself," she said, her tone unwavering. "Tonight, we've heard the voices of a community demanding justice. The question now is, will the city finally listen?" The broadcast ended, and the studio was silent, the weight of what had just been revealed hanging heavily in the air. Jonathan looked at Chris, a sense of quiet triumph in his gaze. They had done it. The truth was out there, and there was no taking it back. As they left the studio, Jonathan's phone buzzed with messages and calls of support, words of thanks from people who had been waiting for this moment, who had been hoping for justice for years. And as they stepped into the cool night air, Jonathan felt an unshakable sense of purpose settle over him. They had turned the tide. The city, the department, none of them could ignore the truth any longer. There was still a battle to be fought, but now, it was one they were ready to win. And with every voice that joined their cause, with every story that was shared, Jonathan knew they were one step closer to the justice they had fought for. As he and Chris walked side by side, the city lights shining above them, Jonathan felt the future beckoning, filled with hope and the promise of a new beginning. Jonathan stood before the city council, his shoulders squared, his gaze unflinching as he faced the row of stern faces seated behind the polished wooden table. The council chamber was filled to capacity. Every seat was occupied by members of the community, journalists, activists, and families who had felt the sting of the corruption he had worked so tirelessly to expose. The tension in the room was thick, the weight of expectation pressing down on everyone as they awaited the council's response. Chris sat beside him, his expression resolute, his presence a reminder of the unlikely alliance that had brought them to this moment. Together, they had fought through the shadows of secrecy, risking everything to bring the truth to light. And now, finally, they were here, demanding justice in the heart of the very institution that had failed them. At the head of the table sat Mayor Louise Grant, her face impassive as she shuffled through the documents Jonathan had presented. The evidence, months of testimony, documents, and recordings, lay before her like a damning testament to the corruption that had plagued the city for years. She cleared her throat, her voice carefully measured as she looked up to address the room. "Mr. Blake, Mr. Harper," she began, her tone cold and formal. "You have come to us with serious accusations, and we take these matters very seriously. But I must ask, are you prepared to defend these claims in a court of law?" Jonathan met her gaze, his voice strong and steady. "Yes, Mayor Grant. Every piece of evidence we have gathered is ready to be presented in court. We're not here for rumors or speculation. We're here to expose the truth." A murmur of approval rippled through the audience, and Jonathan felt a surge of support from the crowd behind him. They had endured years of suffering, watching as loved ones were mistreated, ignored, and failed by the very people sworn to protect them. Today, they were witnessing the beginning of accountability. The mayor shifted in her seat, glancing at the police chief seated beside her. Chief Russell, a man who had long been rumored to turn a blind eye to misconduct, looked visibly uncomfortable, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. He knew, as everyone else did, that this was no longer something he could ignore. Chief Russell, Mayor Grant said, her tone clipped, as the head of the police department, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations? The chief cleared his throat, his voice a low rumble as he spoke. These are troubling accusations, and if true, they warrant serious consequences. But I believe we need time to conduct a thorough investigation within the department before drawing any conclusions. Jonathan felt his fists clench. He had heard these words before, calls for internal reviews, investigations that never went anywhere, empty promises to look into things while those responsible continued to operate with impunity. We've heard this before, Chief, Jonathan interrupted, his voice rising with frustration. You've had years to investigate, years to clean up the department, and yet, here we are. Families in this city have been ignored, dismissed, even threatened, while officers abuse their power. Enough is enough. The crowd erupted in applause, their anger and support filling the room. Chief Russell shifted uncomfortably, a faint scowl crossing his face as he glanced at the mayor, who seemed momentarily taken aback by the outpouring of emotion. Mayor Grant raised a hand to quiet the crowd, her gaze fixed on Jonathan. Mr. Blake, I understand your frustration, but reforming a department as large as ours is a complex process. We can't make changes overnight. Jonathan held her gaze, his voice calm but unyielding. We're not asking for overnight change, Mayor. We're asking for accountability, transparency, and commitment to justice. We're asking for real, structural reform. That means independent oversight, public access to police records, and a commitment to holding every officer accountable. Chris leaned forward, his tone steady. We've provided you with enough evidence to start that process. You have names, dates, testimonies all verified, all documented. It's up to you to decide if you'll take action, or if you'll let this cycle continue. Mayor Grant's expression hardened, her jaw tight as she considered his words. She glanced at the documents in front of her, the pages filled with incriminating details, each line a reminder of the trust that had been broken, the promises that had been betrayed. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice low but firm. Very well, she said, glancing at Chief Russell. Effective immediately, Chief Russell, I am placing you on administrative leave. An external review board will be appointed to investigate the entire department, and any officers found to have engaged in misconduct will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. A ripple of shock and approval swept through the room. Chief Russell's face drained of color, his mouth opening in protest. But Mayor Grant silenced him with a raised hand. This is non-negotiable. The people of this city deserve justice, and we will not tolerate corruption within our ranks. The room erupted into applause, cheers filling the air as people stood, clapping and shouting their approval. Jonathan felt a wave of relief wash over him, a sense of victory he hadn't dared to hope for. He glanced at Chris, who gave him a nod, his expression one of quiet pride. But as the applause died down, Mayor Grant raised her voice again, addressing the room with a solemn tone. I want to be clear. This will not be an easy process. Reforming our police department will take time, effort, and commitment from everyone involved. We ask for your patience as we work to restore the trust that has been broken. Jonathan felt a pang of skepticism. They had been told to be patient before, urged to wait for change that never came. But this time, he vowed to himself, they wouldn't let the momentum slip away. They would hold the city to its promises, ensuring that every step was taken, every reform implemented. As the council meeting concluded, Jonathan and Chris were surrounded by people offering words of thanks, hugs, and handshakes, each one a reminder of the lives they had touched. Families who had lost loved ones to police violence, community leaders who had fought alongside them, friends who had believed in their cause. They were all here, a tapestry of resilience and hope woven together by a shared determination for justice. Maria joined him, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce hug. You did it, Jonathan, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You made them listen. Jonathan held her tightly, a surge of gratitude filling him. He looked at Chris, his old friend who had risked everything to stand by his side, to help him expose the truth. You were right, Chris, Jonathan said, his voice filled with admiration. We couldn't have done this alone. Chris gave him a small smile, his eyes shining with pride. No one can fight a battle like this alone. Takes all of us, standing together. And now, we're finally making a difference. As they stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunlight, Jonathan felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet triumph that resonated in his heart. They had fought hard, had faced unimaginable obstacles, but they had emerged victorious. And while the road ahead was still filled with challenges, he knew they had made a lasting impact. The media swarmed around them, cameras flashing, reporters clamoring for statements. Jonathan raised a hand, calling for silence as he addressed the crowd. Today marks a turning point for our city, he said, his voice strong and steady. We have shown that the power of the people can hold those in power accountable. This is only the beginning, but together, we will continue to fight for justice, for transparency, and for the right to live in a city where we can feel safe, respected, and valued. The crowd cheered, the sound filling the air. A chorus of voices united in hope and determination. Jonathan looked at Chris, then back at the faces of the people who had believed in him, who had stood by him through every struggle. And in that moment, he knew that their fight had been worth it, that every sacrifice had led to this, a future where justice was possible, a future they had all built together. As they walked away from City Hall, side by side, Jonathan felt the weight of his work settle into something lighter, a legacy of resilience and hope that would live on in the people they had empowered. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly free.